And so, thank you very much, all of you, for being with us here today. And I'm really delighted to welcome Nora Revai from OECD. And Nora, you've been speaking in a similar seminar many years ago. It was on site, it was before COVID time and before Zoom and before everything. So, you see how old we are, we have become, all of us. And uh, when I first contacted you, it was about a series of papers about various initiatives and research connecting researchers and teachers, among others, in Norway. But we decided that today you could also talk about a broader thing. But if you want to mention this paper, of course, you're most welcome. If there are references to be shared, we'll share them after that. And so we have about 2 hours. If it's a bit shorter, we'll take a break between both sessions. And thank you very much for accepting to give this presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. And I just would like to say that because it's long and I think it's extremely boring if I just speak for 1 hour, I would be super happy if you interrupted me at any moment with any questions. Like, I'm more than happy to take a very interactive approach, especially people from US and Canada super early. So to stay awake, you probably need to speak a little. So please feel free. Let me just, okay. Can you see my screen correctly? Yeah, okay, perfect. So yes, indeed, with Pascal, we decided to broaden a little bit the scope. So I'll be speaking about bridging education research and practice much more broadly than just focusing on research school partnerships. And I'll be relying mostly on the work that the OECD has been doing these past 4 or 5 years. So here is the plan. I'll start with just a broad picture of why do we even care about education research to start with. I'll be using the term knowledge mobilization a lot, and there are many, many different terms for these things. So I don't have an exclusive, unique preference, but this is just the term we use. So I would like to just give a brief definition of what we mean by this and what we mean by knowledge intermediaries. And the whole first part of the presentation will be focusing more on the system level. So what are the systemic challenges around the use of evidence? What do knowledge intermediaries do and what do they not do? This will all be relying on OECD data that we have collected in these past 4 years, and it's really giving the big picture. And then, because the original request of Pascal was to talk about research practice partnerships in Norway, I will still give a glimpse of some concrete examples of research practice partnerships, which are just one form of knowledge mobilization, but we believe it's a very interesting and useful form, and also because the lab schools do something similar, so I thought it would be relevant for this audience. And then I'll end with just some future reflection points for the future in this field. So I hope this will work for you, and I hope you will find it relevant, because I was a little bit in the dark in terms of what will be interesting for the audience. So why do we even care? And of course, I would not be from the OECD if I didn't use some PISA data. I have to. So this first graph shows on the x-axis investment in education, so expenditure per student in US dollars, and the y-axis shows a score in mathematics. And basically what we see here is that overall countries that invest more are doing better, but that this is not fully completely true either. And there are a lot of countries who actually invest less money, but they are still doing better. So you can see in the top left corner of the chart, countries like New Zealand, Poland, Czech Republic, they are doing relatively well, Ireland, without investing a huge amount of money. So there is clearly much more than just money in terms of the quality of education. A similar chart is showing the learning time, so the time students spend on formal learning, hours learning in school and out of school, and their own reports on how productive that learning is. Now here you can see that there are some countries where students don't report to learn that much. I think you can see Switzerland on the right side of the chart, the Czech Republic, Finland. It's not extreme amount of learning. They actually learn less than in many other countries, but they report to be much more productive in that little time of learning. So again, clearly time invested in learning is not everything. The quality obviously matters. And then this is just a reminder of why do we even speak about education. Clearly, their education has a big role in compensating the socioeconomic status of students. We would really like to give every student the chance to have the best learning and to bring out the best of themselves and have equal opportunities as much as possible. Now, some countries are doing much better in this compensation than others. So I highlighted France in red. France is very bad, but don't worry, I'm from Hungary and it's even worse. So these are just two examples of countries that are really not doing the job in terms of compensating for the socioeconomic status. And this is a big problem. And then, of course, there are countries that are doing a much better job, like Denmark, Canada, actually, Estonia, Sweden, and so on. So, but this is just to say that the quality of education, what teachers do in their classrooms really, really matter. And speaking of teachers and what they do, and this is from TALIS data, so this is the survey of teachers that the OECD conducts, and it shows that teachers actually want to learn. A very large percentage of them report that they attend courses and seminars in person, that they read professional literature. So there is an appetite to learn among teachers. It's important to emphasize that they should not reinvent the wheel, right? There is actually a lot of research on what works, what teaching practices are effective, how can they interact with their students, how can they teach them effectively. And so it's actually really important that they do these things, that they read the professional literature, but also that they reflect among themselves and they reflect and think about the specific challenges that they have in their local schools and the needs of their own students. So one piece of this, and this is really just one piece because education is complex and there are many, many different factors. But one piece, and we believe this is an important piece, is engaging with research. So knowing what the evidence is on teaching practices and actually using that evidence. And sometimes when evidence is not enough, then also generating new evidence that is relevant. So this is just a note of caution of using research, yes, but the how also matters. And it's never, so I will keep saying using research, but what I actually have in mind is thoughtful engagement with research. And that doesn't mean that, it's very rare that research exactly tells you what to do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That usually doesn't happen. What happens is that there are a lot of important information and you have to digest that, translate that, understand what it means for your context. Maybe generate more research, maybe experiment a little bit with that. So there is a whole process of thoughtfully engaging with research, and this comes from Mark Rickinson's work in Australia at the Monash University. I would actually really recommend this piece of work. It was called The Quality Use of Research Evidence, CURE. A really, really interesting big piece of research on the quality use of research. So precisely this aspect of how to use it well. And the way they defined it is critical engagement with the research evidence, shared deliberation about its meaning, and effective integration of aspects of evidence within practice. So this does describe that this is a process. So with that, and again, anytime questions, please just put your virtual hand up and I'm really happy to stop for a second. So at the OECD, we have been running a project which was called Strengthening the Impact of Education Research. And this was to support countries in facilitating the use of evidence, actually not just in practice, but also in policymaking, another important piece. And so we have been focusing on knowledge mobilization and knowledge intermediaries. And what we mean by knowledge mobilization is actually a super broad interpretation of this term. It's any intentional effort to facilitate the use of research evidence in policy or practice. And again, use means a process of thoughtful engagement. So you probably have noticed I'm using evidence, knowledge, and research kind of interchangeably. We are in this project focusing specifically on research evidence, obviously knowing that engaging with research involves the professional knowledge of teachers, and it's always a mix of different types and sources of knowledge. But where our focus is specifically the use of research evidence. So what does this involve? Well, this is obviously not a new thing in education. And for about minimum 25 years, probably more, 30, there has been quite a big focus on disseminating evidence, having it used, making it accessible, generating relevant evidence, and then putting it out. Except it became clear quite quickly that just by putting out research evidence is not going to guarantee that it's used. And so it became clear that relational mechanisms are actually extremely important, that building relationships somehow to bridge research and practice or policy is an absolutely key piece in this puzzle. And this involves supporting collaboration and partnerships, like lab school type of work, to improve knowledge mobilization. It also means building actors' capacity, because this is not an obvious thing. You actually need to understand what research is, what it tells you. Research also needs to understand what teaching actually is and what it is not. And so you need capacity and skills to do this. So relationships matter. The truth is, it's still not enough, because this whole thing sits in a very complex education system, and there are different incentive mechanisms, resources, and the lack of resources very often. Teachers will always say that they don't have time, and they're probably right about that, that there is not enough money for these kinds of things, or not the right type of money. And so all of the system level mechanisms are also really important. So supporting organizational structures and processes. So for example, schools or ministries, if we speak about policy, but also supporting local, regional, and national level structures, incentives, leadership to create the context in which this becomes possible. So this conceptual framework is drawing on Alan Best and Beth Holmes' framework that has been further developed since then. And it's just important to emphasize. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, I don't want to interrupt, but it's a small question about the sources you're quoting. And I was wondering whether you see any difference between what was happening in 2011 and now, because it seems that these problems, these questions have been identified for decades. And so I was wondering whether, having worked in the OECD for a long time, whether you see some actual changes.
So yeah, this is a really, really good question. And yes, what we have been doing, I'll show you some data later, is basically mapping what has changed. So mapping the different actors that participate in this, mapping the mechanisms that exist, but also the barriers. And there has been a lot of development, actually. One of the things is there are more and more intermediaries. I'll speak about this a little bit later. But so including formal like institutions or agencies that have this specific role. So the most well-known is in England, the Education Endowment Foundation. In the US, this could be the Wadsworth Clearinghouse of IES. It still exists. but also other things, other mechanisms. And actually, more and more of these are established. So Flanders in Belgium just established a brand new such agency 2 years ago. The Netherlands has had one, but it's extending its scope. So there is a lot of development actually in this space. They are creating repositories of evidence which are more and more digestible, accessible, but also rigorous, so relying on rigorous evidence. This is also great. The issue is that despite all this development, there are still a bunch of barriers that are somehow persistent. I'll show some of these later on. And so our current thinking actually at the OECD is, okay, so all this development, very cool. What can we now do to address those persistent systemic barriers? So yeah, first thing is who is actually influencing evidence use in education? So it's education systems have really more and more actors. And this is probably true for all the countries. There are policy actors, ministries, executive agencies, inspectorates, quality assurance agencies. There is the research piece, universities, research institutes. There is the practice piece, schools, professional associations, unions, and so on. But then there are a lot of these kind of actors in between these fields. So, for example, initial teacher education providers and continuous professional learning providers are very diverse in many systems, and they can play a really, really important role in this whole knowledge ecosystem. As I mentioned, and that's right, in the middle, these formal intermediaries, brokerage agencies, or whatever we want to call them, so who have an explicit mission to do this job, are increasing. And then school boards, regional authorities, school networks, and of course, some countries are extremely complex, like the US with its decentralized way of organizing education and 1 million actors. It's actually really hard to coordinate all of this. And then there are all the other actors, funders, media, publishers, tech companies that kind of enter in the education field. So it's not an easy job to navigate the system. So I will show you some data, and I'll be drawing on two main sources. One of them is a policy survey that we conducted in 2021. And here the respondents are ministries of education. So we had one response per ministry. Altogether, 37 education systems for 29 countries. That number is different because we tried to aim for the jurisdiction level. So in the US, it would be the state level in federal systems. And this was the aim was to map mechanisms, actors, challenges, what's happening. Now, the other survey, we conducted it in 2023. We wanted to target a much larger set of organizations, not just ministries, but all kinds of organizations that we think play or maybe just should play a role in knowledge mobilization. I'll show you which organizations these were. And here the idea was really to characterize what kind of activities they actually do. And an implicit, well, no, it was an explicit aim, although we knew we wouldn't learn much, is to learn about the effectiveness of these activities. This is actually a big gap. So this is from the policy survey, in which we asked ministries whether these different actors exist in their system and play a role in knowledge mobilization in policy and in practice separately. So the blue bars are they active in knowledge mobilization? The green ones are they active in knowledge mobilization? Sorry, blue bars in policy, green bars in practice. And the little red triangles are whether they are just present, whether they just exist in that system. So I will highlight just two things. One is these formal brokerage agencies. So roughly 1/2 of responding systems reported that they have such a thing. which is actually quite a few, but still there is half of them who don't have a dedicated agency, which is fine. There is no normative assumption there. We are not saying they should have one. They work differently, but just to say that there are many other actors who do this. The other piece I wanted to highlight for this audience specifically, because we are speaking about lab schools, is university-school partnerships, which exist in many, many systems. Interestingly, only about half of the ministries reported that they are active in knowledge mobilization in practice, the green one, which is a little bit surprising because what else would they be doing then? But just to say that actually what you can see here is that there are many, many actors, research organizations, teacher education institutions, consulting firms, and these do have levels of activity in this field. I am going to stop just after this one, just to see if there are any questions. So these are the respondent organizations from our survey of knowledge mobilization. So we had a big discussion of who we should be targeting with this survey. And of course, formal intermediaries, this is the second line, these formal brokerage agencies, was an obvious target group. But we really wanted to see what others are doing. And we saw from the policy survey that in many countries, these formal agencies do not exist. So we need to know who else is doing this job. So we asked research institutions, mostly faculties of education. We asked public intermediaries. So these would be embedded units, for example, in ministries that have a specific role of knowledge or analytical or knowledge units who are feeding evidence into policy. ITE institutes, consulting firms, funding organizations, unions, and inspectorates. So here you can see the number of respondents from each group. There are two bars because so a lot of them overlap, right? Many research institutions are at the same time initial teacher education providers. So we actually gave the option of ticking all that applies. So the blue bar is the number of organizations that identified only as a research institution or a formal intermediary. And then the green one is identifying as that, but also others. And the total number is on the right. So we had a lot of research institutions responding. Okay. Stopping for a second to see if there are any comments, questions until now.
There's a question in the chat. Dina is asking, could you please explain a little more what a brokerage agency is in this context? And I had the same question. I wanted to ask whether there were state agencies or private ones. So it goes together. Thank you, Dina.
Yeah, so many of these agencies are independent. So like, as I said, probably the most well-known one is in England, the Education Endowment Foundation. They were established as a charity, but they actually receive a lot of government funding. So they are independent from the government, but funded by the government. And their job is to translate research evidence for practice. So what they do basically is systematic reviews and meta-analysis. But of course, which teacher would read a meta-analysis with like 1 million effect sizes and understanding what that does? So they translate it and then they develop this toolkit, which shows, for example, metacognition as an intervention is very effective. So they translate the effect size into months of progress. So it gives, I don't know, 4 additional months of progress in learning. It is based on very solid evidence. They have this evidence padlock of 1 to 5, how strong the evidence base is, and the cost. And it doesn't cost very much, for example. And then they have a bunch of interventions, and you can see, okay, this one, for example, costs a lot of money and doesn't actually have an impact. So probably not a good bet. So basically, they translate the evidence into digestible things, and then they also develop practice guides, which are more really for teachers of, okay, how can I, let's say metacognition, it seems very cool, not expensive and effective and everything. So how can I do this in my class? And then they develop these practice guides also based on evidence on how you can actually do this. In the US, the What Works Clearinghouse does something similar. In the Netherlands, it's called NRO. It's the Dutch Knowledge Institute. In Flanders, there is one. In some countries, there are knowledge centers which are only focused on systematic reviews. There are actually very, very different ones. So it's not easy to answer the question because their nature is actually very, very different. And then, for example, I'll give the example of the US. So there is the What Works Clearinghouse, which is a national level body, but then still they themselves say that teachers don't really use their practice guides, or that they don't really consult their materials. So there is a second layer of intermediaries who actually try to connect those resources to schools and to superintendents and local policymakers as well. Those are also formal intermediaries, but they do a different kind of job.
Since
Does
we're in
that answer?
France, yeah, I think it does. Since we're in France, would you say that this is the role that the Institut Français d'Éducation, the IFE, does? Because they sometimes do kind of, not really meta-analysis, but kind of synthesis of research to be used by the teachers. And I'm not sure how much it is used by teachers, actually. I don't know if we have figures about that.
Good question. Certainly, it would be one form of knowledge mobilization. I don't know if we have statistics on how much teachers
Mm,
use it. Another example in France is the JPAL Europe has
yeah.
a French branch, and it's called
Mm.
the IDE project.
You do, yeah, yeah,
Uh, and they also do a lot of this. They
that's
kind of
true.
also generate RCTs and then engage with both the ministry and teachers to do professional development and
It's
things
true.
like that. So that
Mm.
would be another example.
There is also a question
Um,
online in the chat. Do you have data as to the nature of the interactions, quality, type of interaction, etc.?
um, yes and no. I would say I have maybe proxies, and I will show you that data. But very, very good data about the quality of interactions, no. And this is actually something I'll highlight this at the very end, which I think is a very important piece for future research, is really understanding which knowledge mobilization activities, and this includes the quality of interactions, are actually effective. And measuring that, because very, very few people actually measure the impact. And so a part of the reason why I don't have data is because it doesn't really exist. But I do have some proxies that I will show you. Okay, any more? There are some more chat questions. No, I think that's all. Okay, so let's see the data. First thing first, are we even satisfied with the use of research? So here in the next couple of slides, I'll explain a little bit what you will see. You will see the results from both surveys, so what ministries reported and what intermediaries reported. The way we compare them is because intermediaries, so from each country, there were many intermediaries that answered. So we just took the systems that were the same, and then we took the majority. So if the majority of intermediaries said something, then that was counted as one per system. So first thing, are you satisfied with the extent to which they use research in their work? So the they is policymakers or practitioners use research in their work. So with the how much. And what we can see is ministries, 27% are happy with how much research policymakers use. It's always a bit better if it's about yourself, right? Only 15% are happy with how much research practitioners use, and intermediaries are less satisfied with both of these. And then when we look at the how well, so the ways in which they use research, then it's kind of similar. What's a little bit shocking here is that there was not one single system where the majority of intermediaries thought that policymakers use research well. So we are all aware of cherry picking practices, right? Like, oh yeah, I want to do this policy and I found one piece of research that says exactly that. So, and that's not what we want, obviously. So it seems like intermediaries' perceptions are not positive in general. So overall, we are not satisfied with the use of research. Now let's see the barriers. And here are the systemic ones I referred to earlier, Pascal, of these persistent things that exist. The first piece is research itself. And so we asked them whether these factors, whether they consider these different factors a barrier to knowledge mobilization. Is this a problem? So it's really interesting because the lack of relevant research, the quality of research, and the low accessibility of research is perceived as quite a big barrier, or a barrier by many actors of ministries, but not so much for intermediaries. So for me, what it shows is that either relevant research means something different for ministries than for intermediaries. Intermediaries think that this is relevant, but ministries don't think this is relevant. Same for quality and accessibility. Or they are not aware of what's out there. That's also an option, that policymakers are just not aware of what's out there, what research is there, where is it accessible, where can they find it, and what is its quality. But there is quite a big perception gap for some of these things. Second piece, and this is the relationship, and here is the proxy that I can answer to the previous question. Is the lack of relationships a big barrier? Is the low levels of skills and capacity of policymakers and practitioners and the learning opportunities are these big barriers? Now we can see that in policy, interestingly, so when we speak about using evidence in policy, none of these seem to be a major barrier in the majority of systems. But in practice, it does seem to be a barrier. Now we need to note again that it's the darker bar is the ministries of education. So they might not be aware of these things. It's really their self-report, okay? And probably they are aware of the situation to different extents in different countries. But at least they think that there is still a lack of relationships between the actors. Many of them think that. Many of them think that the skills and capacity of practitioners is just not there to engage with research, and that they also don't have enough learning opportunities to a bit lesser extent. Intermediaries see these as less of a barrier again, which is again interesting. It's probably partly because they are doing the work. They are doing the capacity building work, the relationship building work. So they probably know what is happening a bit better.
A quick question, Nora. If ministries think that the practitioners have too low level of skills, doesn't it have to do with training? I mean, teachers training. If you teach people how to use research, they be able to do it. So I feel it's kind of contradictory. So.
Absolutely. And so now I regret that I deleted one chart because I was like, I will never have time. But we do have data on also ministries reporting on whether research skills are a compulsory part of teacher education, present in the majority of teacher education programs, or not present. And actually, it's a huge problem. It's just not present in most countries. In some countries, it's like, yeah, maybe in some programs, but it's almost in none of the countries this is a compulsory piece of teacher education. either initial or continuous professional learning. It's just not there. And then another thing that I will not show you now, but also very interesting, from the intermediary survey, we asked initial teacher education institutions, only them, it was a specific question to these organizations, how would you evaluate the skills of your graduating teachers, those who finish your teacher education? And we listed like, I don't know, 10 different research-related skills. And honestly, a big majority say that their teachers, their graduating teachers, do not have those skills. And it's things about knowing where to access research, being able to read a paper, being able to understand what that means for your context. So it's like a lot of pretty basic things, and they don't do it. So it is a problem, yeah. And finally, and these are kind of the $1 million questions a little bit, these systemic factors. The typical thing, and especially for policy, is the conflicting timeframes. You know, policymakers, they have usually maximum 4 years, but often just 1 year to do something. And that's just not the same timeline as research. So that you can see that in policy, this is considered a major barrier in almost all of the systems. The lack of time to access and engage with research, but also the lack of mechanisms facilitating the use of research, still lacking. Also in practice, financial resources, perhaps a little bit less, but still a problem in many systems. Interestingly, for practice, a lot of the intermediaries said that financial resources is a major problem. So there doesn't seem to be enough money going there. And then lack of organizational openness in general to new ideas, lack of willingness of policymakers and practitioners to actually do this and engage with research, perhaps a little bit less of a barrier as it's reported, although again, funny, the left side, for ministries, this is not so much of a barrier, the lack of willingness of policymakers, but for intermediaries, it is. So again, different perceptions there.
About what we just discussed, we have an observation from Heidi who says, in Finland, learn research methods, competence, and doing research are compulsory in teacher education. One cannot graduate without completing one's own research project in master thesis. So it confirms that teacher training in Finland is probably better than average in OECD countries. And I must say, in France, theoretically, the teachers are a little bit trained and they are supposed to do kind of thesis with their own research. But very often, I don't think it's evaluated. Also, they do it and then it's just put somewhere. Nobody looks at it, and so I think it's also how much value the teachers and the trainers give to it.
Mm.
Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, those are very good points. And indeed, in some countries, it's where in Norway as well, they have a very strong research-based teacher education. So yeah, some countries it works, yeah. Estonia is, I think, also a good example. They only have 2 major universities that train teachers, but both of them give a lot of emphasis to that. Okay. And yeah, we also do need to mention resources in general. And whether this is a barrier. So resources include human resources, just enough people to do this, financial resources, obviously money, just time. And then the kind of soft infrastructure. So this would include things like networks, for example, just having the right networks, having the right type of governance mechanisms, like the infrastructure behind, the soft infrastructure behind this thing, which is also reported as a barrier in many of the systems. So,
everything you said before, there were just means, I guess, from all the countries. Do you have specific data for each country as well? Maybe not now, not in this presentation, but does it exist?
So yeah, in our report, I will give you the links to our reports. There are some data that we published per country. It's a little bit tricky for both surveys. For the policy survey, it's one answer per system, right? Because we asked the Ministry or Department of Education. So you can see if they said yes or no, or if they said strongly agree or not strongly agree, but it's not solid enough. I think what would be interesting at the country level, and we do not have that data, is, for example, to survey an entire ministry of the, I don't know, 300 people. And actually, in some countries, so I know that in Norway, they did a major research project across ministries, not just education, but like cross-sectoral, with a lot of respondents on how policymakers access research, what they do with it, and all of this. Really interesting. And in Canada, in Quebec, they did a similar thing. So some countries have done a little bit of work on this.
Thank you.
So this is a gigantic chart. I will explain. This comes from our intermediary survey. So we listed a lot of different types of knowledge mobilization activities. That's the long list. The kind of grayish section is about generating evidence, so conducting primary research, secondary research, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, intervention and program evaluations, commissioning and funding research, and then disseminating this, so maintaining an evidence repository, disseminating research in user-friendly formats, and establishing communication channels. So this is kind of the linear part a little bit. So evidence generation and dissemination. The second chunk is more related to relationship building. So just mapping who the research users and mobilizers are, whether they facilitate connections and collaboration among actors. So for example, research practice partnerships would probably come into that line. And the next one, which is actually building partnerships with actors. So for example, between schools and universities. Then there is all the training capacity building part, training practitioners and policymakers in research skills, but also training the researchers to communicate research and to engage with users, training the intermediaries to develop these kinds of brokerage skills, and then leadership capacity. And then the last chunk is more like the system level mechanism. So it's system level, either at the organization level, so directly supporting schools and policy organizations in developing the entire knowledge ecosystem, infrastructure, processes, cultural changes, and then directly supporting them with the implementation of practices. So for example, a long-term research practice collaboration would also fall in this line. And the last piece is more like higher level system support. It's first of all just evaluating these initiatives, supporting scaling and sustainability, coordinating knowledge mobilization in the entire system, and creating incentives, processes, infrastructure. So these are all the things. Now we asked the respondents, to what extent are you doing these things? And they could answer on a 1 to 5 scale, where 5 was systematically, 4 was a lot. So here, the colors of this heat map reflect the percentage of respondents that responded that they do this systematically or a lot, so 4 or 5. So where it's red, it means that, for example, I'll take the first line, conducting primary research, research institutions, obviously, almost all of them do this a lot, normal. So interesting things about this heat map. I will highlight a few things. Facilitating connections and collaboration among actors. Actually, a lot of organizations do this, reports doing this a lot. So all these different types, including initial teacher education institutions, inspectorates, funders, consultancies, they all report to different extents that they do this. The cold part of the heat map is the training, interestingly. So very few of them, or much fewer, report training these different actors. Almost nobody said that they care about training researchers in doing this, and then even fewer train intermediaries to develop this kind of brokerage capacity. So that seems to be really a missing piece. And then perhaps this last one is also interesting, creating the system level infrastructures, processes, incentives for knowledge mobilization. Again, quite cold. Now, just a very important note to say, we do not want this heat map to be read everywhere. That wouldn't be cost efficient. That doesn't make any sense that everybody does everything. So we produce this heat map more as a reflection tool for countries. Like, look at this, maybe do it for your own country and think about it. Like, who do you want to do these things? Do you want really consult? It's also interesting. If you look at consulting firms, they report doing a lot of things. Is that good? Do you really want that consulting firms do all of these activities? Up to you. But question to ask. One thing I always highlight, this goes back to the previous point, only half of initial teacher educations reported that they train practitioners systematically to help them use research. Now there, I personally do have a normative point. I think it should be 100%. But of course, question to countries. Sorry. Maybe I'll stay here just a second if people have questions, because I know it's a very, very big map.
Yeah, it's an incredibly rich map, indeed. What's striking is also that training intermediaries to develop brokerage skill, it's almost nowhere.
Yeah. And I will give one example. I brought just two kind of case study examples, and one of them is for that, just to say that some people do, but very few.
Do you have any comments or questions so far? Do not hesitate to, yeah, as Nora was saying, when we are far away, even if it's early morning, it it will keep you awake to ask questions or to comment, because we're in different countries.
I have a question. Do you think that, you're asking agencies and ministries these questions, right? And not teachers, so my question might be not as relevant, but I'm just curious about across countries, the accountability systems that are in place. How do those different systems maybe change the answers that you might see in these questions? Because one of the things that I always feel is that teacher learning, teacher research in the United States at least is kind of curtailed a little bit, maybe because of the pressures that teachers feel on in terms of the accountability.
Yeah, it certainly does influence. So as you said, here teachers were not respondents to this survey. But for example, you can check inspectorates, which is an interesting thing. So in many countries, inspectorates play an accountability role, like they audit schools, for example. And so when you look at the things like directly supporting schools with the implementation, obviously few of them do that because that's not their role. But actually what's interesting is that some of them do. So in some countries, these kind of accountability institutions also have a supporting role. So I think that's quite interesting. We will soon work a little bit more on that data specifically, just to dig a little bit more deeply into that to understand what kinds of things inspectorates actually do. But yes, all of this is definitely influenced by accountability. And I mean, even partnerships, right? Because in systems where there is very high accountability, and for example, there is free school choice, schools are in competition with one another. They want to get high on the ranking. In England, that would be Ofsted. And it's not obvious to collaborate in that environment, right? They are not necessarily incentivized work together. And there are models that they have, like DEF has the research school networks, which is built on a model of collaboration among schools to help each other. And now it works roughly well because they made it somehow work, but it was a major issue actually that accountability can be in the way sometimes.
Thank you.
But I think I think actually it could also be a mechanism to support, right? So inspectorates could also inspect the use of research and the way teachers engage with research. And if that would be a part of their job, that could actually be quite interesting to see, okay, in this school, this is working really well. Maybe that's a good example. In this school, they are not doing anything and they are just not keeping up with research. And then that could be a problem. Yeah, Elizabeth? You are muted, sorry.
Nora, thank you so much. It's just fascinating. I just wondered if you could comment on to what extent your data reflects the kind of research that really has teachers who are in the classroom partnering with researchers coming into their classrooms. And I'm asking that because at the University of Toronto, our laboratory school is, we have a master's program that is quite research-based, and it's a teacher education program of 2 years after an undergraduate degree. And I mention that to say that what we find is that our master's students and our teachers in the laboratory school are all engaged in understanding the value of research. But when the teachers in the laboratory school have had opportunity to be truly teacher researchers, working alongside researchers and having the opportunity to have input into what kind of research would actually surface the kind of data that the teachers are interested in using, it makes a difference and would change some of the colors probably in the heat map. And I'm just wondering if you have a special way of looking at that particular branch of research that has active teacher voice in it.
So my short answer is no, not really. Because we didn't really distinguish different types of research. We thought about it and then we thought it's actually extremely difficult to describe the different sorts of research. In our policy survey, originally we did ask ministries about, and then we used, I think, 2 different taxonomies. One was more thematic, like research on, for example, I don't know, school leadership, learning, and the other was on type of research, like effectiveness, efficacy, I don't know, these. And then we just asked how accessible this research was in their country. But with partnerships, we don't have that granular data. So in this survey, in this heat map survey, we didn't include that. It was a very long question, and we kind of struggled a little bit with even just formulating the question. But I totally agree with you that it would be extremely relevant, perhaps more from a qualitative aspect, right?
Yeah. Thank you. And I think it ties into what Heidi's comment about what is required in Finland is not required in Canada. We happen to be very fortunate to have a research focus in our teacher education, but in a long career like mine, I've seen the difference between teachers who are participants and teachers who see it as someone else's work.
So maybe one answer I can give is in our reports, we try to feature this aspect a little bit from a qualitative perspective, and we included some more like case study kind of examples of these approaches when they co-production, basically. So like really producing research together and the different approaches. So in one of them was actually from Canada. Do you know Amanda Cooper? No, she did research on, she's from Ontario, I think, I'm almost certain. And she did arts-based approaches actually to bringing together practitioners and researchers and also policymakers, precisely because one issue was this difference in the language and the whole epistemological perspectives of between research and practice. And so she used different types of arts-based approaches like drawing. Okay, now you have to draw. And then that helped the different participants to understand each other better. And then there was another project in which one of her researchers developed a game. So I thought that that was an interesting approach, but I will give you two more examples just now in a second.
Thank you.
So can we move on from the heat map? Yeah.
I think so.
So, and this will be this part of my presentation will be focusing specifically on these collaborations, research practice partnerships, and what they are and and what they do and what they don't do. And I think people after me will have a much better lived experience. So I'm not claiming I have very good insight. These are case studies that we developed in one of our working papers, so it's not my lived experience, I have to say, but just maybe to give you a glimpse of what examples exist in the different countries. So first of all, why do we even care about such partnerships? And one of the reasons is precisely this collaborative way of formulating even the research questions. And fine-tuning the research to the actual needs and challenges that educators are facing. And I think this is a major piece and comes back to the data I showed you about relevance, that the policymakers, for example, don't see research as relevant. Now, I think this is one of the problems because the actual questions are not formulated together with them, involving them. So this is one reason. And then the other is actually to facilitate access to usable research findings. So the way research practice partnerships are characterized in the literature, and this is probably one of the most cited sources in this field, is that they are long-term collaborations. They actually aim to improve education and or reduce inequalities, that research is somehow but a core activity of the partnership, that they involve different actors in the process, so not necessarily a university, but some form of researcher and practitioner collaboration, and that they shift the whole research process to a collaborative one. Now, typical challenges based on the literature is that there are no appropriate funding structures often for long-term partnerships. As I said, that they just speak different languages often, teachers and researchers, and they have very different epistemological stances and perspectives. But there are also a bunch of bureaucratic and more institutional barriers. Schools and research institutions just work differently with different time arrangements, spaces, everything, and sometimes that actually makes it really hard. And we had some examples, for example, from Germany, where teachers had to ask permission to participate in such a thing. The permission is given from like whichever the lender, the state level. It was just not possible to obtain. So there are a whole bunch of bureaucratic obstacles that are present in some countries. But despite this, there are some good examples. Oh yeah, before I get to the good examples, this is some of our data that I think is actually quite interesting about the culture of research use. So this comes from the policy survey. So this is ministries' perceptions, which is important to say, about practice. So it's a perception. It's not practice speaking. It's not the teachers saying this. But the majority of ministries, interestingly, say that the motivation is there, that using education research in schools and teaching practice is actually important for practitioners, that they are also expected to use it in their practice, and that there is political will to use education research in fewer countries, but still the majority. When it comes to willingness, more than half of the systems still think that practitioners are willing to try new ways to integrate research, that they are willing to learn new skills. I think the third point is super important, though. Practitioners are willing to use education research to question their ideas and preconceptions. We also asked the same question for policymakers, and they systematically reported this less. Like that, there is, and this is a difficult thing, right? To actually question your own, ideas and existing notions. And then, interestingly, the relationship piece was reported much less, like whether there is a high level of trust in research itself, whether there is a high level of trust between practitioners and researchers, and whether they actually have a shared understanding of research and its use. And less than half of the system reported that this is there. Now, for me, the big question is whether this is a condition of well-functioning research practice partnership or an outcome, or both. I will ask this question to the US and Canadian colleagues who have more experience in this. I wonder really if this is needed to make it work, or this is something that develops over time. And then this is the skills piece, and I have the same question. Is this a condition or is this an outcome? That teachers actually have, this is again ministry's perception. And almost for all of them, roughly half of the systems said that in general, practitioners have the knowledge and skills to evaluate the quality of research, understand research and interpret it, find and access research, translate, apply, communicate it to their peers. So just talk about it with their colleagues, formulating the needs. And then there is the piece of co-designing and co-conducting research with researchers, which is even less present or less reported.
And one thing that's been talked a lot in the framework of this seminar, and that I don't see here, it's the question of time. And teachers who are full-time teaching full-time, of course, they can take time to read research, to understand, find, and access research relevant for their needs. But as far as I know, they only have 24 hours in their days. And what's been repeatedly mentioned is the question of time. When do they do that? And even collaborating with teachers, with researchers, unless they get some time off to discuss with researchers, to fill up forms, to co-design protocols. I don't think it's ever going to work. And there's one example in Bielefeld in Germany. They have a lab school where teachers can get some time off, either a whole year or some part-time positions, so that they can actually conduct a research project. And this seems to work, and I think it's the only way. And I have a small experience of the ENAB research project. It's a research project about mental health of primary school and middle school children in France. Teachers are expected to fill up tons of forms about each student's mental health or school achievements. And I asked several times, but when do they do that? Do they get paid for that extra, or do they get some time off? And neither, which I find just very shocking. And as long as they don't have this time, I don't see how this can improve. And I feel that, especially research literacy, I'm not sure teachers themselves would agree with these figures. I don't know what you think, Nora.
That's a big question, and we always emphasize this is what ministries think. That doesn't mean that teachers think the same way. But responding to your question of time, that does come up a lot. Like I showed you the barrier slide, and it's always, we don't have access, where we don't have time to access and to do this. It's always a major barrier. Now, in addition to the examples that you mentioned, there are some countries where this is actually built in teachers' tasks. So it's a core task, and it's built in their time. So it's, again, a system level incentive or condition that is either there or not there. but it can make a difference if it's there. And the other question for me actually is, do we really want, and is it even feasible that every school and every teacher engages in research and does this all the time? Probably not. But then the question is, what is the model that will work? What is the scalable solution to this? Maybe a few schools, a few teachers do some things, but then there is an issue with, I have seen a lot of examples for partnerships that stay very small scale, and it doesn't even spread in the school. There are two teachers who are involved in it, and the rest of the school doesn't even know that. So that's also a problem. So there is this whole issue of how do you actually make sure that it has an impact on the whole school and then more broadly on the whole school system. And these are key things that we would like to actually explore a little bit with some of our partners in the future. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So I wanted,
Sorry,
yeah.
just a little comment. I was wondering if we compare with medical doctors, of course, we have hospitals, which are university hospitals, where research is being conducted. But then we also have clinics where there's no research, or even general practitioners. They don't do research, but they keep updated with, or they're supposed to at least, being updated with the latest state of knowledge. But not everybody has to be a researcher. I fully agree with that.
Yeah, exactly. And the medical field is very often an example for education. Of course, when you speak to people who are specialists in the medical field, they will always also say that, well, it's not perfect there either. But it's true that some of the mechanisms are just much more developed, and it's just an absolute standard expectation of doctors to keep up with research. We don't want to be operated by someone who has no idea what the most recent method is, right? So, yeah. Okay, so two good examples, because we spoke too much about barriers. First one, this is coming from Germany. And as you saw on the heat map, this is the blue line of training brokers. So one example where they do this, this is the Leibniz Institute for Research and Information, DIF, and they have a project. It's currently in a pilot phase. They have been running it for maybe 2 years or so. It's called Peers for Practice. And basically their objective is to develop broker skills, to nurture this kind of mindset of brokering that appreciates the perspectives of both research and practice. They develop capacity for collaboration, so how to work together between research and schools, hoping that in the long term, this will actually make research practice partnerships more effective. And then they also have a longer term plan to establish and sustain a whole network of brokers. And basically, the way they do it is that they have early career tandems. Now, they specifically decided that they would involve early career researchers. So these would be PhD students or maybe postdoctoral students who just finished their PhD, and early career teachers. And they would work in tandem together for 18 months. And working together involves a bunch of different things. So joint professional development, they actually attend some courses. Mutual workplace observation. So they go to the school, they go to the research institutions and just see what the other is doing and what's going on there. And then they also do joint activities. So for example, joint lesson planning and then reflection after the lesson, and which I find quite nice, social and leisure activities. And it's not just a nice thing to have, but it has been really strongly proven by research that building trust is an absolutely key piece of this. So it's actually playing a role in this. And so these tandems work together for 18 months. And the idea is that they actually do develop this understanding. The researcher, PhD student, will understand what is going on in a school. What does it mean to plan a lesson? What does it mean that there are 35 students in a classroom, and so on. And then vice versa, the teacher will understand how long it just takes to conduct research, what are the processes, what is the methodology, what is the rigor that's required. So really like a mutual development. So they are conducting an evaluation of this pilot project, but it's coming up, so they are not yet there, I think. But I am super curious to see how this project will develop, because there aren't many examples for developing brokerage skills, and I think it's actually quite an interesting one.
Do you know how sorry, do you know by any chance how they build this pair? Because I mean, to have social and leisure activities really means that you have things to talk about. And, is
So
it
that's a good
just
question.
random, or?
I know they had a call for participation in both groups. I don't know how they paired them up. I don't know what the Tinder mechanism was exactly in the process. That's a good question. Yeah. And whether there was a possibility to maybe swap pairs if something didn't work, that's a good question, actually. So the other example I'm bringing is from Norway, because this is what Pascale was mentioning at the beginning, that she found this interesting. So in Norway, this was an example of a specific research practice partnerships. But I think it's extremely important to understand that in Norway, there is a whole system infrastructure for this. And this is quite rare. So they actually have resources, and okay, it's a rich country. So that's a good thing, but they also decided to spend money on this. So they fund higher education institutions to develop partnerships between municipalities, schools, and teacher education and higher education institutions. One example for these funding mechanisms is something that's called the Scheme for Local Competence Development. Now, what is interesting in this scheme is that the funding is for partnerships, but they do not fund research outputs, because that's often something that happens, is that what the funders fund is that you have to produce a paper. But this is not the goal here. That's not, and that's how it actually works. The funding is given, the money is given for developing a long-term partnership. And then it's also really important that a whole lot of organizational incentives exist and are in place. So, for example, the University of Stavanger, the Faculty of Education has more than 100 academics who have this as an explicit part of their job, that they develop partnerships with schools. It's just part of their job. Their job is not just publishing in peer-reviewed journals, which we know is a major problem in academia. And so, yeah, this is the part of their job. And then there is also an organizational strategic objective, which is aligning research and initial teacher education goals to the jobs and to the school's needs. So there is a whole infrastructure, both from the system level, from the organization level, that allows such partnerships to actually work. And then this specific example, it was called MoveB, is one partnership that was developed between the University of Stavanger and I think it was a vocational school. And it's really interesting because originally what the university wanted, so first of all, they had meetings with the school to identify areas which would be interesting for the school. So the school said, okay, we have a big problem. Students are not motivated. They just don't want to come to school. And we want to work on this. So the university said, okay, cool. Then we will summarize the research. So they looked into the research. They identified, based on the evidence, 3 different strategies that can improve motivation. They had a lot of meetings at the beginning, and they really emphasized this in their description of it actually took quite a long time to just understand the context, to just understand what the real problem is in the school, and then to speak about this research. And then their idea was, okay, we have identified these 3 strategies. Now you can try them out. And that's what happened, except that a parallel mechanism started to happen, which was that teachers also wanted to experiment with different methods. They had ideas actually on how to make it work, which were not part of the research evidence that the university people brought. So then they co-developed together with the researchers 3 more strategies. And they ran an mini experimentation, not hyper rigorous. We are not speaking about an RCT here. But they experimented with these strategies. And so they co-constructed new evidence. Again, not RCTs, but still, they looked at the data, the student data, they looked at indicators on how these strategies actually improve student motivation. And then they also produced things. So they actually wrote a paper together, even though that was not the core piece of the funding, but still they co-authored a paper with the teachers, research papers, and also publications oriented more for practitioners. So I thought it was a really interesting example of real co-creation with a combination of deductive and inductive mechanisms of, yes, from research, but also from the experience and practice of schools, and then a mechanism to actually create more or enrich the evidence with things that the schools do. So that is the example. And then what we saw, so we had, this was published in a working paper, and we had 3 examples, 2 of which I have just shown and 1 more. And we looked at how each of these examples try and address those typical challenges that I spoke about. And basically what we saw and what the authors said is that in terms of funding, it was extremely important that the funding scheme is pragmatic and flexible and doesn't just consider one of the contexts, either research or schools, but it considers the entire partnership as a whole, and that it's adapted to the local circumstances. Another piece that was considered important is the organization and system governance. So incentives at the system level, but also within the organization. So support from senior management, for example, in the school and in the research institution. And then consciously designed soft infrastructure. And by that, I mean a set of meetings, like really dedicating time to develop a way of working together, to find the spaces where they can collaborate, to find a time that suits both parties. And they did emphasize that this took a bit of time to construct these spaces. And then the third piece is, of course, these skilled and respected brokers who are able to bridge the 2 communities. And then a few questions that still remained after, or like these 3 small case studies. One was about impact and effectiveness. And we asked all the 3 groups of authors to give us every piece of information that they had about impact and effectiveness. They all did evaluate in one way or another their initiative, or are going to. And of course, the intended outcome would be making research more relevant for practice and increasing its accessibility and use and improving learning for all students. Now, when it comes to evaluations, the truth is that they were all internally conducted evaluations, not experimental, so there were no serious counterfactual mechanisms. And they were unique measures, so they developed their indicators, but they are not measures that are maybe comparable in the literature. So this poses a little bit of problems, because one of the things that we don't understand very well yet is the effectiveness of these mechanisms. So this is still a lack. And then the other piece is the organizational and systemic conditions. So in general, the literature says that individuals' attributes, so skills, for example, mindset and so on, and the nature of their relationships really matter, that the organizational structure of these RPPs matter, and that system-wide factors matter. That's good and clear. There are some elements, though, that where we don't have enough understanding and knowledge. And one is the relationship between institutions and their broader context. And that brings us back to these kind of bureaucratic barriers and also the accountability question that I think Jay asked. So what do those broader contextual factors actually mean for the way partnerships work? And then the other piece is system level strategy versus bottom-up approaches in different governance systems. So one example was from Germany, which is a federal system like the US. So education works really differently in different lender. The whole thing is decentralized. So what is the role of a system strategy and what is the role of bottom-up approaches that come from schools and local universities? How can the two be aligned and how can we just make sense of the whole scaling question that we have just talked about? How can we make it work in a way that it actually improves education as a whole? So these were the two examples, and I'm almost finished. The only thing I also wanted to just share is kind of some food for thought for the future in this whole space. And one is about building a robust body of knowledge in education. What does that involve? How should we go about that? So how should we design and support an effective educational R&D system in which we can actually systematically build and refine the knowledge base? And then this entails a lot of different factors. So it's about ensuring the quality and effectiveness of brokerage efforts, scaling up effective initiatives, but also improving methodologies and processes and understanding how this can work. So one example is using AI. Now, obviously, it's a big question of how can we use AI for synthesizing evidence, for identifying gaps, for many other things. But there are still many questions around a more systematic strategic approach to this. And another related piece is this kind of what works in what works. So how do we know that a knowledge mobilization effort, and that can be a research practice partnership, or it can be something different. How do we know if this works? So this was a question that we asked in the intermediary survey. Does your organization monitor or evaluate the reach and impact of its knowledge mobilization activities? More than half of them said no. A bit less than half said at least occasionally. Yes, in some initiatives or in every initiative. Now, I don't have this, but we actually also asked them, if they said at least yes occasionally, we also asked them what kind of indicators do you use? And we gave a long list of indicators. And basically, and absolutely not surprisingly, most of them look at easy things like downloads. How many people downloaded our practice guides or whatever, how many people accessed our website? How many people showed up in our events or training sessions? So nice, yes, but it actually doesn't tell us much about the impact. It doesn't tell us whether this actually changed their behaviors, whether it improved their practice, let alone student learning itself at the end of the day. So a lot of questions there. And we do think at the OECD we will be working a little bit on this in the future, that we need to somehow build more empirical evidence on knowledge mobilization itself. How it can work, what does it mean, how can we make sense of its impact? And then another piece is supporting these intermediaries. And again, when I say intermediaries, it can be formal agencies, but it can also be initial teacher education institutions or anything really that play a role in this space. And it involves a lot of different pieces. It involves driving the generation of relevant evidence that actually policymakers and practitioners can use. So just mapping the different actors, their needs, and the available evidence, and understanding what's missing. And also coordinating these evidence synthesis and databases across intermediaries. So the good news, as I said, Pascal, is that there are more and more of these things, but it also makes it really hard to navigate. Like, where do I find the answer to my question? How do I know where I go? It's really difficult. So now, actually, in our current phase of the project, we are building a meta navigation portal to try and help navigate across these repositories. The other piece, as I said, is just improving knowledge mobilization itself, which involves evaluating it or making sense of the impact. But it also actually involves making accessible the practices that already exist and that already show some impact or are promising. So just creating a bank of resources. This again exists, for example, in the health sector. The WHO has like a big chunk of resource bank with a lot of these things. And then there is the capacity building piece, in particular for intermediaries, and they can learn a lot from each other. You have mentioned several good examples, and I'm sure other people who are doing similar work are not necessarily aware of these examples. So just facilitating that kind of learning across intermediaries in terms of how to do this is also a key piece. And you have made it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating and lots of food for thought. I'm sure there must be a lot of question, additional information, experience sharing. So I'm going to give some space for the audience. I have also, of course, some questions and further additional remarks. So, Elizabeth, it looks like you were going to speak, but you're muted still.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Again, thank you, Nora. I'm really interested in the question that you asked, and it sort of rang through the rest of your presentation about whether all schools need to be doing research or just who should it just be those who are interested, and if teacher education shifted a little bit and people came in with capacities to use existing research or even to be in big R research with funded researchers, would it make a difference? I'm interested in that because unless we get the answers to some of those things, it's going to be an obstacle that we'll either have to go through or around for a long time to come. I'm particularly asking now whether the OECD has a map in mind for how to increase the participation in and the use of research, and what are the variables that you find make a difference to the quality of partnerships when there are, for example, school-university partnerships? What makes them work a little bit better or to flounder when particular individuals go elsewhere? Because floundering is something I'm familiar with in these patterns of partnerships, that they don't last forever. What would help us to have a more robust approach to research in school partnerships in, let's say, 10 years from now?
Mm-hmm.
This is where I feel like disappearing. I cannot answer your questions. They are really difficult. But they are the right questions, I think. So one of the things that we would like to do, and I don't know if this answers your question, but one of the things is, because as I said, a lot of things are happening in different countries, and some of them are thinking about this very seriously. And one of the things we are going to do is developing these system level knowledge infrastructure case studies. So like, for example, the Netherlands, I'll say this example because there have been a lot of thinking about this in the Netherlands in the past few years. And what we want to do is to describe how this whole thing works in their system. So a map of actors, who does what, how do they distribute and coordinate the roles, and what are the key pieces that they are doing and maybe that they are struggling with still. And this would also include pieces of transferability. So what is it that's context dependent, or what kind of context do you have to have these mechanisms or these mechanisms in place? Because obviously the Netherlands is a very small country, it's super decentralized. It's not going to work in the same way as, I don't know, for example, the US or whichever, France. So we would like to give these pictures of knowledge infrastructure systems, and we hope that, it's difficult to answer your question because, as I said, we don't have super robust data on what works in these things, right? But at least having examples and at least understanding that in those examples, these are the things that are still not working, and these are the things that seem to be working well, maybe already a little bit helpful.
Thank you.
And then the same things for smaller activities like research practice partnerships. So we will be looking for these kinds of more systemic, not just the case study I showed in Norway, which are like small examples, but more from a systems perspective. How do you put this in place in your system? So if this exists in Canada or elsewhere, please contact me. It will be interesting.
Any other question? Yeah, Nicolas.
Nora, thank you so much for all the valuable information that you have shared. At the International Association of Lab Schools, we benefit greatly from the work that you do. And as you mentioned, there are many institutions that struggle to include research, but I also heard that you were talking about the expertise and the practice of the teachers in the classroom, and how research could also sort of guide that, but I also see it the other way in terms of teachers not having maybe the time or the space to do research. But if someone would provide the time and the space, then teachers could either confirm their practice through research or make adjustments if necessary, or continue doing what they're doing in the classroom uh, um, because of the results of research. So as an international organization, we do have many laboratory schools that have the resources and others that do not. And this broad view of research is really impressive, and it gives us a lot of information and hope for us to continue doing our work. So thank you so much for what you do, and I hope that we can establish, or that this connection that is established today, we can continue strengthening and moving forward. And what you do is extremely important. I think it's major in our world today to have our decisions and to have our reality reflected in empirical data. I think that's very important for education all over the world. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. I would like to reciprocate that appreciation by also saying that we do need to, and I think one of the things we can maybe do is just raising awareness of the existing mechanisms and initiatives. So it's really important for us as well to learn about what the International Organization of Lab Schools do and the different other initiatives, because it can actually be very helpful for other countries or different types of organizations to just learn what exists and how it works. So definitely we are interested in drawing on your work as well.
Any other question? I'm not sure I can see everyone on screen, so if you want to speak, just take the floor. Meanwhile, in one of the last slides, there was something about mapping what works, and I think that from that point of view, what Education Endowment Foundation does was amazing. Also because of these little labels they had about how effective it is and how many months, as you mentioned, how many months increase, or also how much it costs and how easy it is to implement. And I'm wondering if we're aware of how much it's used, because I had, again, about France, because it's where I live, but I was a bit skeptical about some new things that were introduced in disadvantaged areas, which was the first grade. They just drastically diminished the number of students. They had 12 students instead of 24, but at the same time they didn't change the teachers training, and so what happened as a result is mostly that the students had the same kind of course there was a bit more interaction with the teachers because mechanically there's only 12 students in the classroom, but except for that, it didn't prove to be very, very efficient. And so now people are complaining about that. But on the website of the Education Endowment Foundation, EF, it says that this kind of measure is very, very expensive and not necessarily very efficient. And when I told people in France, I told some inspectors about that, they said, don't talk about it, don't say that. So it was like a typical, in French we said, fausse bonne idée, so wrong good idea. And so I'm wondering whether this type of resource is used also by politicians. I mean, I speak very freely here, and I hope I won't suffer any bad consequence for being so straightforward.
Stay in the room.
I would say it's my English. My English is very bad.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question. And just anecdotes of actually, I spoke once with one person from EEF, who is the head of evidence synthesis. So, and he has an important international role as well, and in touch with different actors. And he was asking me, Nora, do you know why all these French actors are asking me evidence about school uniform?
I was thinking about that.
I was like, yeah, I know, because they want to introduce school uniform. And he was like, yeah, but there's no evidence on its effectiveness. Like it's
Is there evidence against? I mean, it would be interesting to know. Mm.
no, I think I actually looked at that just because I saw this whole debate in the French politics,
Mm.
and I looked at their toolkit, and that they basically there isn't evidence at all. Like there is
Mm.
very little evidence. And almost nothing on student outcomes. So I think it's important to know that the EEF looks at certain outcomes, but not all outcomes. So they focus
Mm.
primarily on student outcomes, and there may be mediator effects, right? So, I mean, I would certainly not really believe strongly in school uniforms, so I don't know,
Mm.
but just in theory, there it might
Mm.
be that it improves something that will eventually improve but yeah, no, not a lot of evidence. And then the same thing happened with the small class sizes, with ability
Mm.
grouping. So there are a lot of things that politicians pick up precisely because they just want to make a difference in a short time
Mm.
frame. And
Yeah.
it's really a pity that they don't necessarily engage with, and that the whole argument is not that, look, this is what has been found extremely effective in evidence,
Mm.
and this is why we are doing it. But I know that there are some mechanisms. So the ministry sometimes consults IDE.
Yeah.
And again, it's like this is also anecdotal, but sometimes they consult it and then IDE explains exactly the evidence and then they do the opposite. So then what can you do?
It's discouraging, yeah.
But actually, so just a higher level reflection on that, the EEF has a lot of data on how much their evidence is used in England specifically. So it has been increasing a lot, and a lot of schools and teachers are accessing it. And they are now working on understanding the actual impact. So not just the downloads, which is the easy measure, but also like what we know about the use of this evidence more specifically. So they are working on a framework to just do more research on what impact that makes, which will be interesting. And they also have an international network, and many other countries are translating and adapting their toolkit into their local context. So it's kind of like a developing ecosystem also internationally. And then EF is not the only thing that exists. So there are actually a lot of quite interesting repositories with good evidence synthesis. And I think it would be very valuable for policymakers to have a navigation tool to understand what they can find where.
I'm not aware of the other institutions that you mentioned. I think EF is very easy to navigate as well. It's very clear. If you have a few more resources to share for that, it would be very useful, I think.
Yeah, sure. I can do that.
So is there any more question for Nora? I think this is also a very important talk for the second talk we're going to have. After that, maybe I suggest we'll have about 15 minutes break. And I have maybe one last question for Elizabeth and Nicolas, and maybe we can go on talking about it, and Chris as well, of course. Lab schools have very different practices, very different sizes, and there's nothing like a lab school. This is it. So it will make it very difficult to have a kind of general survey and trying to evaluate whatever impact, except downloads or website visits. But I wondered whether this was a project of ICE to have a broader view of the practices in respective schools.
So lab schools are very different, yes. But in the past few years, as an organization, we have concentrated much of our resources in research, and we have had research groups from our membership gather data through research, and it was fascinating because most of the data that Nora shared, we have seen it somehow. The fact that teachers understand research one way, the administration sees it another way, and then in terms of the different stakeholders and their views, we have run through that in the past few years. And as the presentation was going on, I was thinking that although not all of our lab schools or not all lab schools have a research component, we see research as one of the characteristics of lab schools. Not all lab schools conduct research, but as the presentation went on, I kept thinking that even when research is not one of the characteristics of a lab school, there's always research and there's always data in lab schools, because what lab schools do is try to show the world before it happens anywhere how it's happening here, and how our teaching practices, what is the result of a teaching practice or of an innovative practice somewhere before it happens anywhere else. So the big name of research is also different. What is research to one school, what is researched in one country, what is researched in another country. So yes, this helps us tremendously in the work that we're doing, and it gives us a lot of direction, and it also helps us see things that we didn't see before. Like before coming to this presentation, I wasn't thinking about that lab schools who do not actually have research as a descriptor, I didn't see, or I was not looking at the fact that yes, maybe not in a particular or defined way, but we all do have data to share with others.
And I think
Thank you very much.
we also have the benefit, don't we, Nicolas, of being stronger together. And this will be one of the themes in the next hour, perhaps, that we have each other. And so we, Chris Bogert, who's on the call, and Richard Messina have been involved in research collaborations that strengthen us all. We can find out what's a common question and have people in their own laboratory schools approaching that question, sharing the data. And we have an arm that publishes and makes available to a very broad audience the outcomes of that research. So we really benefit from having opportunities with schools around the world. I'll just mention also we have opportunities for little case studies. So I'll mention one. I loved your examples, Nora. I love the things that work, being part of what you're talking about. And there's one, and I shouldn't be the one speaking about it, but I don't see on the call anyone from Falk Laboratory School in Pittsburgh. I know we have someone from Pittsburgh, though. Welcome, Carlo. It is that Falk figured out a way to find that time that we've been talking about that's so important for teachers and researchers to be together. And they bought out part of the time of one of the professors in the Faculty of Education that was, of course, linked to their laboratory school because research was one of the things they wanted to do. And that person, Katrina Bartow-Jacobs, is in the lab school. In the week, there's a schedule of when she's there, and they have now an application process where teachers can apply to have more or less time released from their classroom work to be part of research. I won't get into any more details than to say it's well worth a look just to watch a school that is starting a process and showing results about how to build a partnership. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. So, is there any more question for Nora? Just speak up if you want to. And if not, Nora, thank you very, very much. It was a very interesting food for thought for, I think, the month. and I hope we'll keep in touch and meet in Paris sometime.
That would be lovely. Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. And just to say, you can obviously share my slides if people are interested.
Thank you.
That also includes links
Thank
to
you very much.
the publication. So no problem.
Okay.
We would also love to see you. We would also love to see you in one of our conferences as well. So
with pleasure.
I can put you in touch, no problem. So, I suggest we have like 15 minutes break, if that's okay. So you can all go for coffee, and we'll meet you again at Paris time. It's 2:35, so I guess 8:35 for you, right? See you later.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.